So my name is Alsaffar and I live here in Ottawa. I came over to Canada from Dublin in the early 1980s, and I came over my honeymoon to Newfoundland. And so my story is I'm the first one in my immediate family to come to Canada, to immigrate, but my mum's from Dublin, my father's from Leitrim, and Leitrim being from the west of Ireland. A lot of his family, he was the only one who was left in his family. His mother was the only one from her family, so my dad was a Fitzpatrick, and he's from Drumreilly in Leitrim. And I remember, I have 4 kids. I remember when we would go back home to Dublin and then go visit Leitrim, he would tell the kids, my boys and daughter, he would bring them around into the around the crossroads and that, tell them where they would have crossroad dances, and they would take out a barrel porter and they'd sit there and they'd play the fiddle and whatever, and that's where they had their dances. Then he'd walk further up into the mountains and he'd show them different places where there were barns or there were homes and whatever, and he'd start to cry and he'd tell them about the time when it would have been his mother was a Charles, and my dad was born in 1920, and then so my grandmother was born in 1886, so it would have been her family then. Would have had to leave, and the people who had left had got on the ships and went, but the ones who stayed, they owed a lot of tithe, or a lot of they owed money, rent, to the English. And the women would get on the donkey and they'd get on the donkey and ride all the way to Ballinamore, which would take them half a day or more to get there, and they had to be there at 3 o'clock in the afternoon before it closed. And I'm actually feeling bad telling you, I feel emotional telling you this, but if they didn't get on time, there on time, or it was the wrong day, they would be told to go back and they'd have to come the next day. And they'd come the next day and maybe they were late. And he told the story of one time they were late, and then I think the soldiers came back and they went into the mountain and they burnt down 5 homes. And the men often gave their kids and their wives the food, and the men would be working, or the men would have had to leave. And he said this was called the mountain of the 5 widows, and these were all women who's lost their husbands, had nobody, had only got their children, and an awful lot of them would have died as well, because they had nothing, they were left then, their houses were burnt down. And he talked about listening to the cries of these people dying in these fires. And even now, he'd say that when he was a kid and he was going to dances and stuff, and there'd be certain times at night they'd be walking, going home at night, and they'd hear the cries of the banshees in the bushes, and this was the souls of these people kind of keening and crying for the dead. So the kids, I don't know if they really appreciate exactly where they've, what they've come from, but it's really hard, and it's amazing to see the resilience of the Irish. So I was lucky in a way. My dad then moved from Leitrim to Dublin, and he worked as a carpenter, and then he became an architect in the corporation. He worked there. So I left really as a nurse, because they were looking for one. I was really as an adventure to come to Canada, but I lived in Newfoundland for about 2 years. My oldest was born there, and I have 4 kids, and 2 of them have gone back to Ireland, and one of them's, they're both there now. They're married. One of them is married, and they've been there for about 7 or 8 years. They are going to come back, but they feel more Irish, I would say, than Canadian, even though they were born here. But it's an incredibly rich heritage. One of the reasons I came to Canada and I came to Ottawa was because when we looked at all the cities, this was about the oldest one. And when you think about it, I was in Dublin during the millennium, when when we had all these little, this wonderful festivity about it being 1,000 years old, and then you come to Canada and they talk about something being 200 years old, and it's ancient, So I think that Ottawa did give me that sense of home and everything, which was greatly appreciated. But I'm very proud to be Irish, and I'm really glad that my kids appreciate that background.